All right, I see we are recording and streaming, right? Everyone can hear and somewhat see each other. I know we're not using cameras for everybody, but everyone can hear me okay? Okay.
Yep, I just admitted Sue.
All right, good. All right, well, in the interest of time, we will go ahead and get started. I'll go ahead and call tonight's meeting to order. The record show we've got all but one member present virtually tonight, Jim Gerke. I believe he is planning on attending, but we'll go ahead and start without him. So do I have a motion to approve tonight's meeting agenda?
I'll make the motion, Lisa.
Thanks, Corey. I'll go ahead and second. We have a motion by Corey and a second by Seguin to approve tonight's agenda. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll move to a roll call vote.
Ms. Rosenau?
Aye.
Ms. Deppa?
Aye.
Ms. Seguin?
Aye.
Mr. Black?
Aye.
Ms. Johnson?
Aye.
Ms. Roser?
Aye.
All right, we have an approved agenda. The only item on the agenda tonight is to discuss a potential levy referendum. So we will go ahead and dive in. So Matt, would you mind sharing that one document that you and I talked through this morning? Or do you want me to share it?
You can share it, or I can. It would take me a little bit. Here, hang on.
Let me, I'm doing this from my work computer, and Google Docs does not like my work computer, so it's hard for me to share. But so Matt and I we talked quickly this morning about just kind of how to structure this meeting, specifically related to how we can be able to show kind of the work that the committee has done, as well as the work that Matt and Mary have done to help us understand the various scenarios that we could be talking about tonight. But so I think one of the things that we talked about is just kind of making sure that we generally have consensus on doing something this fall. And I think we've had a couple of conversations over the past several weeks about, this fall, next fall, pros and cons to each. It feels to me like we generally have consensus on doing something this fall. I know that tonight we're going to discuss all the various scenarios as well as the committee recommendation, kind of get into some of those numbers. We've also acknowledged that we have one board member who has expressed some concern with the approach of this fall. And I think each of us has also probably likely heard from at least a handful of constituents who have expressed some concern for going out this fall in an odd year election. I think I'll just say that I think one of the strongest arguments that I'm aware of, and I have personally experienced from doing a referendum in an odd year as opposed to an even year, is that I think our community can really focus on what the school district needs in a non-year election without the noise of a political campaign happening at the same time. Our goal, obviously, from a school district standpoint, is to educate our constituents on what we need, so that when they show up to vote, whether they're voting for it or against it, we want them to be educated with as much data and information as we can possibly give them. And I feel like a lot of times those education campaigns get really lost when we try to do them in the middle of a partisan storm. And we all know, we've all experienced, especially these last few years, right? Like the political climate is pretty fiery right now, and it's hard to get a lot of messages through to people when they're listening to all that other noise. So I mean, that's sort of my perspective on it. I think others share that, open for discussion, but I just wanted to kind of say that for the record for tonight, that from my opinion, I feel like that's one of the primary reasons that going out this year is probably going to be to our advantage. I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that. I know we've talked about it in the past, but I just kind of wanted to say something on that topic tonight.
You want to go question by question, Lisa? Is that kind of your hope? Is that question number one, and get people's thoughts? Is that kind of the general thought process?
Yeah, I mean, like I stated, I think we have general consensus. So if we feel like we've got that consensus, we can move on. We don't need to rehash it to a certain extent. I just wanted to give everybody a chance to say their piece if they wanted to say something specifically about it, since this is a public meeting and it will probably be recorded. It's good for everyone to be able to get their voices out there if we have specific things we want to say.
I personally don't have a problem going out for an election on an off or an odd year.
Thank you.
And this is Rachel Deppa, and I am opposed to going out on an off year and very vocal about that. I don't think it gives all voters a chance to have their say. But I do understand the need for a referendum. Can you guys hear me okay?
Kind of. It's really garbly.
Let me see if I can switch earpieces. That might help.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, I think that's better.
I mean, I've voiced the concern about going out on an off year. It's probably my biggest concern about the referendum is that it doesn't have as many voters voting usually in an off year. And I would like to hear from the entire community when we do the vote. But I do understand the need for the referendum. And so that's where I've stood on this since the beginning.
Okay. Okay, so I think, yes, we definitely have a little bit of conversation on that, but I think I think for the most part, we do have consensus that we're going to do something this fall. And so the next two, I think, are somewhat related. I think we've got a recommendation from the committee that met on this a couple of weeks ago. I think each of you has been marginally educated on what the committee recommended after looking through some of this data. The committee basically recommended a 3-question approach. The committee, just so you guys are aware too, is myself, Jim Gerke, and Rachel Deppa are on that committee. We met and kind of walked through some of this and did some of the number crunching. And we came out of that committee with a recommendation of 3 questions. But I think I want to make sure that we use the time tonight to talk through all the scenarios and the pros and cons of each. I don't want anyone to look at the committee's recommendation as needs to be the final call, because I do think that there are some other options that we could certainly talk about. Also, I think since that meeting, Matt has talked to Don Lifto just to kind of get his perspective on, opinion on a 3-question approach and things like that. And he proposed a potential another thing for us to talk about, which would be a 1 question to revoke and renew at a higher amount, so that we wouldn't necessarily have 1 question that was only a renewal, and then a 2nd question to potentially go a little bit higher to help avoid any additional cuts within the district. So I think I don't know that it's a lot of value right now to weigh the 3-question versus the 2-question. I thought it would be good for us now to at least go through and review kind of the implications based on the renewal and some possible increases, so that everyone understands like what the scenarios would need to be, what cuts we would need to make with each of the scenarios. So what I asked Mary and Matt to put together here is kind of just that, right? What does a renewal look like from a tax perspective? And what does a renewal look like from a reduction standpoint? And then they did the same thing for all the possible scenarios for an increase scenario at 300, 400, 500, 600, all the way up to, I don't remember how high it goes. But if we talk about just the renewal, I think this is an interesting thing for us to look at, because this, according to the survey data, I think Don Lifto referred to it as a no-brainer, right? I never like to look at things as a no-brainer because we always have education to do, especially in a relatively conservative county. But I think what this is basically saying is that if we had a question on the ballot that was only to renew the existing levy at $370 per pupil, there would be no increase to taxes. The survey supported that data by about 72%. But if that's the only thing on the ballot and the only thing that passes, we still have $1.3 million that we would need to cut from the general fund budget. And Mary and Matt have done a decent job here of kind of showing what the equivalent of $1.3 million would mean to the average taxpayer in terms of the number of teachers, the number of non-teachers, programming. We use an example of 7th and 8th grade activities here, and then possible implications to things like activity fees. So I think this sort of speaks to what Mary and Matt have been telling us, is that a renewal isn't, we need to do a little bit more than a renewal if we want to be able to avoid some pretty drastic cuts. And then also just to remind everybody what 1.3 million, you know, it looks like a lot looking at this. We've made reductions over the past 3 years, right, in bits and pieces, and we've reduced a little over $1 million over the last 3 years. And I think even that sometimes feels hard to swallow. So if we had to do if we did 1 million over the last 3 years, and then next year had to do 1 million all at once, it feels like that would be kind of a hard pill for people to swallow. So before we move on, does anyone have any questions on that, on the renewal piece of it?
I'm looking at the spreadsheet in the drive that's 5/18/21 levy scenarios for budget projections.
Yep.
And the tab that says zero additional, only renew, still shows us at 12% fund balance over target of FY 2021-22. And doesn't go negative until 22-23. So is it essentially the 1.33 million is to stay at, it looks like on the next tab, it's to stay at 12% and have a fund balance over target of positive 621. That's that scenario. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't have the spreadsheet in front of me, but Mary, is Mary on the call, by the way?
You should be.
Yep, I see her. Mary, can you address Amy's question? Because I can't pull up that spreadsheet right now. I'm sorry.
Yep, I'm
Do you want
pulling
me
it
to
up
share
myself.
my,
Hang on
I
one
was
second.
gonna say, do you want me to share my screen since I have it up?
Sure.
Yep. Is it show? Oh, hang on. Sharing?
Yep.
Okay, so in this scenario, am I looking at this correctly, Mary? So this one is zero additional, only renew. If we were at the 12%, which is what the goal has been, then we go negative 22-23.
We're not, well, we'd still be at 9% in 22-23. We're just almost $900,000 below the 12% target. Our fund balance in 22-23 is still 2.5 million. But
Okay.
then you see the next year is where we dropped to 404,000 for a
Right
fund
here.
balance. Yep.
Okay. Okay, gotcha. And so then that's where this tab comes into play then. If we want to stay here.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
You can, here, I'll stop sharing.
So does anybody else, good question, Amy. It's always helpful to tie it to the actual numbers as it relates to the fund balance as well. Does anybody else have any questions about the renewal only scenario?
Are there scenarios where we would see an increase in enrollment that would affect that we would then not have to reduce?
You know, I am building in already an increase in enrollment based off of what we lost this current school year. So nothing in our scenarios shows a huge positive increase in enrollment. It's still looking like we're going to be graduating bigger classes than we're bringing in. I think that's just our trajectory for these next few years that are within this projection model.
Okay. I keep hearing about these 300 houses. People seem to be of a lot of opinions and what about that? So are we not anticipating that to impact our enrollment?
I had a conversation with the city on that. Phil and I have talked quite a bit about this. And what we're seeing as a trend is, because I was expecting a change in enrollment potentially just based on migration, right? With the building of the homes, we started to have double-digit increases of building permits even starting back in 2018. But the problem is that what we're seeing as a potential scenario is that there may be a family that moves into that house, maybe with one school-age child person, maybe a kindergarten or ready to come into kindergarten or first or second grade, but it's not like an instant family of 3 or 4. So the delay to the enrollment is approximately about 6 years. So we're seeing all these houses. That's what my original thought was. Well, we're seeing all these houses, all these developments coming out. How come this isn't directly impacting school enrollment? It's delayed because families are moving in and they may not have another child, just one that's school aged. Where that impact comes in later on is when they have a brother or sister, so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so then I think the next couple of paragraphs in this document, I think pretty clearly outline a couple of scenarios that would potentially go after an increase. So if we were to do either part of the same question or a second question, which has to do with increasing the levy, I think we have a couple of different scenarios here at 300, 400, 500, and 600. Now that's per pupil increase. That's not the impact on taxes. I think people kind of sometimes mix those things up. But if you think about a 300 per pupil increase, the tax impact of that is about $132 annually on a home valued at $300,000 in Delano, which has been roughly estimated at the average size home in Delano. So if I have a $600,000 home, then I would basically double the 132, and that would be my tax impact at a more expensive, more highly valued home in Delano. Survey support for that was almost 60% at 58.5. With that scenario, there are still reductions that are needed, and you can kind of see again the equivalent of that of about $600,000. And so you can see this repeats a couple of different times, and each time you see the per pupil increase goes up, the tax increase on the average home goes up, and the reductions get smaller. So and we also included here what the survey support was. Now remember, the survey support was polling, I think, you know, the handful of people that they polled, they would say that it was scientific. It covered parents, non-parents, females, males, try to get a good age demographic, Delano, Loretto, Franklin Township, right, a good geographical portion. The survey support for this potential scenario is relatively good still, higher than 50%. As we increased that, the survey support started to go down. One of the other things that we saw in the survey data, which we called out earlier and above in this document, but basically the survey data is also telling us that the more people got educated on what was happening within the school district, the higher their support was for potentially paying more in taxes in order to avoid those kinds of cuts. So I think while at the same time, we want to look at the data in terms of like where our threshold might be for a tax increase, I think we also want to look at the data to say that people are generally willing to listen to what the school district has to say, and certain types of cuts tend to cause people to react in a way that might allow them to say, okay, well, maybe I can actually spend, you know, a couple more dollars a month then in order to avoid, you know, 6 teachers getting laid off next year or whatever that might be. So that's part of that was a lot of the discussion that we had as a committee a couple of weeks ago that kind of prompted us to be able to say, maybe if we're going to ask for an increase, we should try to ask for what we actually need and not just what we think taxpayers would support based on the survey. Because if we got a really good educational campaign out there and we made sure people understood the implications to all of this and the why it was needed, then we might have a higher chance of getting an increase passed. So that was part of the logic that went into the recommendation that the committee had of going for a second question that would ask for an increase in the levy. So I'm going to give you guys a chance to kind of pause and read through these on your own or on the screen and just kind of ask some questions about that and poke holes if you want to, or if you will, on kind of what the committee recommended, which by the way was an increase of $500 per pupil is what the committee recommended for the second question.
Is there concern that asking so many questions will cause confusion
Yes.
and therefore cause people to just be like, I don't want any of this?
I think that's a real scenario, Jenny. I think that you don't see very many 3-question ballots, which is why I think we wanted to kind of talk about this. We struggled as a committee because we felt pretty strongly that we wanted to have some sort of scenario that allowed us to ask for what we need to avoid any more cuts, which is essentially the $600 scenario. But I don't know, we sort of struggled with like what the right balance was. That's why I think it's good for us as a board to put our heads together to talk about other scenarios and figure out, you know, what do we think we can pass and still and make sure people understand what it is that we need. So sorry, long-winded answer, but yes, I think it can be confusing.
And so the third question is an additional $100 per pupil beyond the current, right? Or not an additional $100 on top of the 500?
No, it's an additional 100 on top of the 500.
It just seems that it's such a dramatic jump from like keep it the same to we're gonna go and ask for, you know, our top dollar. You know, I don't know. So you try to, I mean, I guess though, I understand too, if you offer something in the middle, most people are probably going to take the middle. But it makes me nervous that number one, we go out there and it's confusing. It's confusing to me. I'm trying to learn all of this. And I have to imagine I am probably one of the many who think this is incredibly confusing. And then we go out in a year where I think, quite honestly, hasn't been the best, right? You know, we've had some ups and downs, and maybe more downs than ups in the eyes of the community, I think. And we're either asking for flat or we're going out and asking for top. And that concerns me a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you at all, Jenny. I think we as a board, basically, one of the things that I think we have to decide is if we don't think that the voters are going to give us what we think we need to avoid cuts, we have to agree on a scenario and understand ourselves what the cuts are going to be and be okay with those cuts. So if we say, and that's part of what we struggled with as a committee, because none of us wanted to sign up for, 7 FTE getting cut, right? If we only went out for $300 per pupil increase.
And it's an automatic cut as opposed to spending down our fund balance. So we automatically would jump to cuts as opposed to going, and I'm trying to understand that as well, like our fund balance in respect to other schools' fund balances or districts, and the fact that we have a fair amount of padding, and what do we do there? Like, why is it automatically that we go after some of our full-time equivalents?
Well, I think we could certainly talk as a board about changing the policy in terms of what our minimum fund balance is. I think I would need Mary's help with understanding whether or not that would be a good idea or why. But right now we have policy that states that we need to have a minimum of 12% in our fund balance.
Yep, and so right now we're looking at ending the year with about a $5 million fund balance and going into next year, spending down over $1 million of that again. You can only do that for so long, but if you are looking at going below the 12% fund balance, we are going to have to change our policy as well. Otherwise, that is something that comes up in our audit. So that's just something to be aware of as well. I mean, you can certainly spend down the fund balance if that's the board's decision, but that's also your safety net if something happens at the state level where they start withholding our payments, which they have done in the past. And it was only because we had a fund balance that allowed us not to have to go and cash flow borrow, which was a cost, would have been a cost to the district of $30,000 to $40,000 just in interest and closing costs for a 1-year loan. There are reasons to have a decent fund balance, but it's
Okay.
still a board decision.
Thank you.
So, I certainly do not want to undo the work of that committee. These statements that I'm about to say are not intended to do that at all. I'm struggling. I have not talked to one person that supports a tax increase. Considering we're coming out of with COVID impacts, both to their personal finances, people who own businesses. The city's doing a $79 million purchase for a park in the city of Delano. People are definitely, they have that on their mind. Now all they see is increase to taxes. We get it. We get the short end of that stick. To me, that is why I feel like it's so imperative, if for nothing else, for us to really get that renewal secured. And so that's why I'm asking a lot of questions about, okay, what if we potentially focused on just the straight renewal for this year? Unfortunately, maybe not do the cuts to the extreme, bring the fund balance down to the 9%, and really then come back in that 2022 year. And then ask for truly the increase that we need, and really get the education behind that so that they're separated. I get the political thing, Lisa. I believe me, I've been through almost, I feel like, every scenario of bonds and levies that I ever thought I ever would have liked to in a lifetime. It pains me, but I don't see the community support, regardless of the 300 people that were surveyed. And that concerns me. That is the first time that I've never encountered a person, even after educating them, doesn't say, and I know the survey said after education, the likelihood to approve increased. Yeah. So that's kind of mentally where I'm at.
Yeah, I hear you. I think I struggle a little bit personally with, I just don't know that it's going to be any better next year. Right. So, I mean, it might be, it might not be, but I do trust the survey data, at least in terms of the nominal support. I mean, we hang out in different crowds potentially, right? But I haven't heard the same negativity that you've heard, right? I have talked to a number of people who are at least willing to listen, right? And our understanding of what the school district is up against. So I think it all kind of depends on who you're talking to and what their situation is, just like anything, right? None of us knows everybody in the district. We all have a different kind of population there. But I think,
yeah, I mean, these people I'm hearing, these are supporters of our school district. These are not naysayers. These are people that have said, I just can't support a tax increase right now. And that is my fear. My fear is we're gonna have people telling us what we want to hear, and then they're gonna vote a different way.
yeah, that's very possible.
So
I think
I just want to know, I would be remiss if I didn't share those concerns.
I think as one of the committee members, just to let you know on some of our logic, I believe, was, this first go round, if we didn't get it passed, if they voted no, at least we could get a gauge of support. Did it get voted down by 100 votes or 1,000 votes? Is the 500 per pupil way too high and we have to come back and ask for less? We were at least going to attempt a stretch of what of what we truly needed to see if we could get support with education.
Yeah,
Right,
that's a great logic. Yep.
That was the logic behind it.
Which then kind of makes me not interested in Don's, like the repeal, just because I don't want anything that jeopardizes the renewal. Does that make sense?
It does.
That's my, like, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we talked about as well, is that we feel like we at least need an option for voters to renew what we have, because that feels like, I mean, even that, still looking at $1 million in reductions with just that makes my stomach a little queasy. I got to be honest with you, right? And I think it does for all of you. But at least then, if there are enough people in the community who are of the mindset that you just described, Amy, that they can't support anything, at least we could get the renewal passed, and then we would have some data to basically tell us, right, after an odd year election, right, like how many people actually did support an increase.
Yeah.
I don't want people to think of us as doing this as a test though. Right, that's the only thing, because it truly is. I mean, we're trying to ask for what we think we need to avoid cuts, and if this isn't the right year to do it, I'm not convinced that next year is going to be either. I'll be honest with you. And I think that my point about trying to educate constituents in an even year election is, I think it's going to be damn near impossible. And so I worry about trying to get everyone who's going to show up and vote in 2022 educated on what it means, and seeing that voting yes to this will raise your taxes. And if they haven't listened to the messages of the campaign and they just vote no with an uneducated mindset, that makes me nervous as well. I'm fine if they vote no after being educated, but if they're just voting no because they didn't read any of our stuff because they were too busy reading about how they wanted to make sure that Governor Walz doesn't get reelected, right? Then I think we're going to end up being in trouble.
Are there other activity scenarios? Again, not a popular opinion, but I'm trying to talk through lots of different scenarios. So obviously we've focused on FTE classroom teachers, et cetera. And then we're really just 7th and 8th grade activities. Is there anything else we could do there as part of that, of shifting that 1.3 million or other cuts?
We took this information from, if you remember, 2 years ago, we facilitated a feedback session from our internal stakeholders. And that's kind of where we looked at priorities there. We went through a priority list. We can always go back and take a look at that. I don't know. I mean, you can go into the arts, you can go into the play, you can go into all sorts of other things. But as far as activities, it's not a, we're at a point, I think, with reductions where we're getting down to people and programs.
Okay. So like moving junior varsity sports to also a pay to play wouldn't save us any money, any of those scenarios?
There would be some savings there. I have never costed anything at that level.
Okay.
I think the only thing I can add to what has been said is that my talking with community members was that if we go out for something and then we want to come out again in 4 years for more, it's not going to be looked highly upon. And so the idea that the committee had come to was go out for what we need, not more, not less, and just be honest with the taxpayer about this is really what we need for the next 10 years or however long that levy is in effect. I don't know that it'll be, the number will be well received, but at least we're being honest with the community about what our needs are based on the funding levels that we have.
Yeah, and I would say that as a board, we probably wouldn't be supportive of going out for an additional levy in between, like, halfway through the existing one, which kind of reiterates your point. I think we want to try to get it to where we think it can last us for 10 years. If we're only able to pass a $300 increase and we end up with that, then these cuts that we make, we're making so that they'll get us through the next several years, right? But yeah, I would agree with that sentiment too, Rachel. We certainly don't want to be having to be redoing these scenarios every 3 or 4 years.
So did the committee have the input from the most recent input from Don around the 400 pupil increase, feeling like that could stretch it and really make that be the second question and then the 600 be the third question? Did you guys talk through that scenario or no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked through, I think that was one of the original things that we talked about was question number 2 maybe should be the 500 per pupil increase because that shows over 50% support from the survey, right?
You mean the 400?
I'm sorry, is that what I said? I don't say that?
You said 500.
Oh, sorry, 400, yes, we
Okay.
talked about that. And then Rachel, I can't remember if it was Rachel or Jim or somebody brought up, well, if we're going to try to stretch it and we're going to try to say, well, education tends to increase support, why don't we go for closer to what we need so that we still don't have to cut $400,000 more? But I think that's why we're talking about this, because I think we could all be persuaded to say, well, maybe we should just go for 400 because that's what the survey said, right? The survey support showed a higher likelihood of that than the 500. We were trying to think again about what it would feel like to cut $400,000 additional out of the budget, knowing that we just did that this year and we're getting into people and programming, right? We're not really able to do much anymore with some of the smaller cuts that we've made because they're starting to feel big. So we did talk about the pros and cons of 400 versus 500 and the cuts and things like that back and forth there.
Okay, and the 51.2% survey support is uneducated for 400?
No, I believe it was, well, I don't remember, sorry.
It would have been, I believe it's after the 4 statements of if we don't support this, this could possibly happen.
Right.
Okay, so it was lower, uneducated, it was lower?
Yes.
I'd have to,
Oh boy, okay.
Yeah, on average, it went up like 20 points after education. So it was a very significant jump.
Okay, because I was getting confused because I thought the baseline recommendation from LIFTA or from whoever in the survey was that there was majority consensus on 150 to 180 tax impact. But what I'm hearing now is I thought that was uneducated. That's educated?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Because the tax impact is about what, just under $100 from the 400 to the 600? It goes from 180 to what, 275, I thought the number was?
225. 80 to 225.
I thought 225 was the $500.
Oh, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't hear your question. What was your question?
My question is the difference between the $400 pupil was 180 impact.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 275 or the 600 is the 270. Okay.
Correct. I thought you asked 500. Sorry. Yes.
So $100.
Yes. Yeah. So to go from 400 to 600, it's an additional $100 a year. Roughly. 90 actually, if you want to be.
Yeah,
exact
no,
about it.
I get it. I'm trying to put myself in the mindset of somebody who's just really against a tax increase, and is the logic, which I get is sound logic to say we can talk them into between the 225 to the 270. I'm thinking, okay, what is I'm just trying to think through this a little bit.
Yeah.
And this, so now I'm confused because this says survey support 37.8%. I'm assuming that's uneducated.
No, it's a stretch goal. It's definitely a stretch goal without 300 people's opinion of the data.
It's an educated support. Matt, do you have the survey data in front of you, or does someone can someone bring it up? Or it's in the shared folder out on the
Yeah,
on
I'll
the
pull it
file
up.
as well. But I
Trying to
believe
look it up right now.
so. The renewal didn't have, and I don't remember. It did have an education component to it as well, but I just want to make sure that we're looking at apples to apples for all of these. And I'm sorry, I don't remember all of the scenarios. I thought that all of these were after education.
I believe they were, and it is true that, yes, as we get higher, the support drops. So obviously it was a stretch.
Right.
So, yes, we could change our logic to, the second question should be the 400 per pupil, and then the third question be the 600, because that's the number we need to not have reductions.
Right.
And if you are someone that is opposed, but yet you have kids in school, you may vote yes, yes, no, just so you can say you voted no on something. But you have to know that you have to get the first one yes, the second one can't pass without the first, and the third can't pass without the second. So if someone votes no, yes, yes, it's not going to work, right?
Correct. So yes, that's a potential change to the scenarios as well. If we feel like we want to rely more heavily on the survey data, because we will have a strong education campaign this summer and this fall. So if we feel like we're going to be able to educate everyone who walks into the polls in November, and they will have these implications in their head when they go to the polls, we feel like we have more than 50% of a chance of passing a 400 per pupil increase based on an educated campaign, then perhaps a tweak to the questions that we proposed would be question 1 is a renewal, question 2 would be a 400 per pupil increase, and question 3 would be a 600. Or we just do 2 questions, which is an option as well, right? To Jenny's point, if 3 questions feels overwhelming, too much, right? Throwaway question, right? People talk about that as well. Like, I think sometimes people want to have something to say no to, and we don't want them to say no to our second question. That terminology makes me nervous because it makes me feel like we're not asking for what we need, because we really think that we need these, right? I don't want to make any more cuts to the district. But if we're saying in this climate, we're going to have to regardless, then maybe we don't put a third question out there. And we as a board just all agree that we know that we're going to be continuing to make cuts for the next several years. We have to decide as a board if that's what we want. Then maybe we say we don't need that third question and we actually are just going to make the cuts.
For just going through the survey, I just went through the survey. These percentages are after, it's not the initial support for the increase, it's after informed support.
Right. That's what I thought.
So Matt, can you look at slide 28? So I'm looking at that and it says support versus cost by past voting activity. So it says our very active voters at 270, that number of support is 22%. So can you help me understand what that is?
It's according to the survey, it's basically stating that the active, very active voter is a little bit initially with like a small amount of increase is initially trending. It's basically trending lower than an inactive voter or a new voter to the community. And then it trends basically the same and the gap widens a little bit once you push it out to 270.
Correct, but it's the uninformed?
Not just uninformed, it's just less active. No, this would be, I'm not sure, I'd have to go back to Don because he doesn't state in this slide. He gets down to slide 38, I believe, is where he starts to differentiate between uninformed and informed.
So,
Yeah.
so one of the data points one of the demographics that they broke out the data into, Amy, you remember this probably from 10 years ago,
Yeah,
is the difference between how somebody who votes in every election, regardless of what's happening, versus someone who doesn't, right?
right.
And obviously, in a perfect world, we would want to get the people who vote in every election, we would want to get the most support from them. But
Right.
they tend to be the ones that do not support it, right? For the most part. A lot of the ones who vote in every election are also the ones who say, I'm not going to increase my taxes ever, right? They tend to kind of be the same people. So,
Yeah, no, I agree. That's why I was hoping for a little bit of a higher percentage there than 22%.
Right.
So,
You got to remember that's based on the last, I think it's 6 to 9 elections. This is not based on survey results.
right,
This is data that he pulled from how did you guys perform in your last elections versus very active, and less or new.
oh,
So
so
it's
this
not
isn't,
based on the survey.
gotcha. Okay, that's good to know. So this has no tie back to the actual people they spoke to and mapped back any sort of how often did you vote? There was no question that asked their voting pattern.
No, they pulled from databases of past election results.
Okay,
right.
Okay. Sorry, I certainly didn't mean to derail us.
No, that's okay.
These are confusing enough conversations, and so I was trying not to like take us on any sort of a rabbit hole ride.
So I guess that's another question that I guess I would like to sort of get everyone's opinion on is we as a committee use the words, we want to ask for what we need, right? And when we say what we need, to at least the three of us that met in the committee, we interpreted that to mean we wanted to stop making cuts. So maybe there's a discussion we have to make as a board or some consensus we have to get to of like, is there a tolerance threshold across the board right now to keep making cuts, keep deficit spending, keep kind of operating the way we've been operating because of the environment that we are living in and the potential adverse reaction to a tax increase? Like, do we need to reframe how we talk about this in terms of what we need? Like, is what we need to keep making cuts? I guess that sounds really draconian to say that, but like, is that where we are right now?
I mean, if the consensus is that it's not going to pass this year, I'm agreeing with you, Lisa. It has no chance to pass next year. So if that's the consensus, or if that's what I'm hearing from people, then, you know, the biggest support is to renew the levy and cut $1 million. That's
Why
not
do we
what,
think it has no chance to pass next year? Why do you think that, Jim?
I think the demographic that comes out next year to make sure they get their voice heard with Governor Walz will vote no on tax increases.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious.
That's one person's opinion. That's my feeling. And to like Rachel's point, you know, the people that don't want it in an off year, those are the same people that don't want to vote for tax increases.
The
They
people
say
that
that-
just want it in an off year are the same ones that are not going to vote for it next year either, I think, right?
That's what I mean. It's it's a group of people that feel we're sneaking it in. Well, it's because they want to come out in a huge group next year and vote no. I mean, that's my feeling. I could be wrong, but I believe that.
Yeah, Jim, I agree with you. I think that logic is hard to refute. I love the way Lisa opened the call with, if we do it this fall, it's a way for us to get the community very focused on making a decision to further a really high performing school district or not. And everything just gets lost in the shuffle next year. So I support us doing this fall. I also think that as a group, we just need to agree what the number is and go for it. And, if we put 2 or 3 questions on the ballot as a board and we approve that, then what we're doing is we're approving voters to weigh in and tell us what they want. If we as a board say, no, we're just doing 1 question, we're just doing a renewal, then we don't even give the community a chance to weigh in and tell us what they want to do in the community. Do they want to support the 2nd question, the 3rd question, or not? I really think we owe it to the voters to let them weigh in on this thing and move forward with, for sure, 2, maybe 3 questions.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it, Corey. I think I would like to think that there are a fair number of people in this community who would sacrifice, a couple of cups of coffee a month to make sure that we don't have to keep getting, letting teachers go. I guess I would like to think that. I know it's possible that it's not true, but I think to your point, Corey, I think we would be remiss if we didn't at least try or at least ask them.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think we have to be careful though. And I always appreciate opposing sides, right? So there's always 2 sides to look at this, regardless of your political affiliations, et cetera. I get the concern for next year, but for all of the reasons, Jim, that you said, what you just said, and what Corey just said for us, is we owe it to the taxpayers to be able to have a voice. There are going to be people, right, who feel like their voice isn't being, because it's an off year. So I just want to make sure we're really grounding ourselves in that. And there are plenty of people in this community that definitely support our school district and want to see it flourish. What we've heard this past year is just a concern over the impact that the bond had to their property taxes. That was a big significant hit. We knew that. I think at the time, right, we fund or we budget the operating levies to only last 10 years. We know that that's the reality of having to reevaluate every 10 years on how much we need to operate the school. But I think we all thought and hoped that we would get a little more money out of this operating referendum. And then clearly that just isn't the case because of the different downfalls and the shortfalls from state funding and a whole host of other reasons that would take hours and hours for us to dig into. But that's the reality we're at. But the fact of the matter is there still is a tremendous negative opinion on the bond. So we're going to be spending a lot of time, and we just have to prepare ourselves, educating our tax-paying community on the difference between an operating levy and the bond. And I don't know about any of you, but that's the majority of the conversations I've been having lately, is helping even now in advance of this, because people are already talking about this in the community. We've done a good job of starting to communicate that we're thinking about this. So again, we just have to remember, we do have a traditionally more conservative tax base, or people who are a little bit more conservative about it. And that's the reality. So anyway.
I wanted to add, and I do disagree with Jim and Corey. I believe that really, if we're worried about those people that will be coming out to vote in 2 years, then we're not doing a good enough job of educating them. A lot of those people that have talked to me that said, not on an off-year election, are still going to vote yes for this if it comes up in 2 years. What they're voting no against is when they feel like we're trying to sneak it by them. And so I think that throwing these people into a category of, well, you're coming out to vote against Governor Walz is unfair. And maybe we do need that time to educate them and that extra year to say, this is what we need, and get them educated and ready to vote, and get what we actually need out of this.
Yeah, and I disagree. I think, I don't know, like we'd have to line them all up and ask them. But if someone has the opportunity to vote this year, which everybody does, it's never been easier to vote in this country than it is right now. Everybody has a way to vote, whether you mail it in or absentee or show up to the polls. Then if you're voting no for it just because it's this year and not next year, I don't get that rationale at all. Like I can't wrap my head around why someone would vote no for it just because of the timing of it. I don't even know that we need to go into it. I think we all have differing opinions on that. It's probably not worth our time to go into. It seems like it would be somebody just voting based on principle, right? Not actually like, and especially if they're saying that, oh, if you ask me again in a year, I'll vote yes. Like just because of the election year makes kind of no sense to me at all. But I think that's a good example, Rachel, of people telling you what you want to hear, what they think you want to hear, and they're like, oh, they're gonna vote no regardless for the most part. But we can agree to disagree on that one, I think.
Yeah, again, the majority of people that express, they were like, this is just not a good year. It's not the year for me to absorb an increase. As much as I support the schools and want to see it flourish, I need to recover. I need to recover financially. My taxes are out of control, et cetera, et cetera. Those are more of my concerns, or not my concerns, the concerns I'm hearing, because we all are in very different positions, right, of what this impact will be. So
yeah, and I think we could probably debate that for quite a while, because there's a lot of people that look at the economy right now as it is booming, and the stock market's as high as it's ever been in history, and now is a great time to go and get this buttoned up so that we can look forward and start to make real change in Delano schools. So I mean, all good points from Amy. You've made fantastic points tonight, actually, and from Rachel. Honestly, we could debate this for a really long time. I just think as a board, we need to figure out what the number is and go for it. So you can kind of see which direction I'm leaning on this.
Yeah, I agree with you, Corey. I think, and I agree with what you said too, right? I think there are some people that, despite the year we've had, are actually performing quite well financially. So again, it's just a matter of who you talk to and where we think people's appetite is here. But I think the reason I asked the last question I asked is because I just want to, I'm kind of trying to gauge what the board's appetite is for, because I think this will help us get to the question, right? In terms of how much of an increase we think we want to ask for is where's our stomach at in terms of the cuts, right? So if we do decide to go for even just say a 2 question for right now, a renewal and then an increase of either 300, 400, or 500, just to play devil's advocate, any of those has cuts involved. So what is our appetite from a board standpoint in terms of taking on those cuts next year, and working with the district to make sure that we do those in the right place? And does that help us drive the dollar amount at all? Or do we look at it as a tax increase on the $300,000 amount, right? How do we feel like people would be able to potentially tolerate, if it's $180, how does that translate from a monthly standpoint? If you look at the difference between the 132, the 180, and the 225, I don't know, maybe we look at those. To me, it's about the cuts. Like that's the part that I'm struggling with. Jenny, I know you mentioned that you don't like the 3 question approach. I agree that it is confusing. How are you feeling about an increase?
Good question. I just kind of feel like I'm sitting back and listening to everything. I obviously don't want cuts at all, but I do worry about going after such a big increase.
So those 2 statements contradict each other.
Well, I know, and that's why I said it, right? Like,
yeah,
I mean,
and
none of us are going to say, yeah, let's sign up for cuts. That's, of course, I think all of our talent that we have is amazing, right? But I do worry that if we go out there asking for the moon, that we are not going to get it, right? And so it's like, okay, do we need to be more reasonable and have something in the middle? But again, I mean, you guys are all great and talk through this at length, I'm sure. So I'm struggling with, you know, I certainly don't know better is where I guess I'm at.
Definitely see how you got to 3 questions. I mean, I get it. I mean, to Jim's point, then it gives, I mean, it definitely gives you data. One way or the other, you'll have yes data, no data on a couple of different dollar amounts, but at the same time, it's still 3 questions.
Right.
And both increases are outside of what the majority support was per the survey that we.
Yes, that's that's the concerning part. And I think I guess, like I've already stated, and I'm just restating that if people get confused and we miss it, then what? Then we're kind of falling back on that last chance. And that concerns me. Sorry, Jim.
No, good. Some of the logic too was apparently in the past, we had asked for $900 and that had failed. And then we came back and asked 2 questions of 400, and they both passed. So this was part of our logic of giving people choices of what they want to vote yes and no to.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Because I would love to just say, okay, here's the renewal. Question 2, 600. This is what we need. We don't want to come back and ask for more again. So like Rachel said, or Amy, someone said, let's just be honest with everyone. If we don't get the 600, we have to make cuts. So we gave it a shot this year. We want the 600. That's what we need. But if it overwhelmingly fails, then we come out next year and we ask for less, I guess, because we know that 600 is going to fail again. So, and maybe we get another shot at it the following year. Another reason to try it this year versus only taking one chance at it next year, because after next year it expires and it's over. Then we will have to cut. At least this year, if it fails, we don't have to, it's not expired until next year. Is that correct, Mary?
Correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. But if we don't make certain reductions and we wait until a latter year, it'll be more.
Oh, okay. So this 1.3 is based on it passing this year
Yes.
or
It's
failing?
Passing next year.
Passing next.
Passing next year, yeah. It's just ongoing.
Okay.
If we just get the renewal, then it's the 1.3.
Correct.
I feel like I'm trying to rack my brain historically. I feel like it did fail, and then we cut, and then it passed. So
We came back with a lesser amount in year 2. That was Matt's first year as superintendent.
I mean, they're not, again, we don't want to make the cuts, but there is that element of it being just in theory versus reality. That helps people get it, not that they can't get it otherwise. So that sounds insensitive, but again, I mean, that's the one thing that would maybe say a 2 question, but.
Right. To your point, Amy, if you actually cut 7th and 8th grade activities, people are going to flip out, right? But if we sit here and tell you, you might lose 7th and 8th grade activities, you don't want to go through with it, but my Lord, that would be a shocker, right?
And I'm not sitting here saying we got it cut to make them feel the pain, but pass it. But I mean, that is definitely something on the 2 question option versus the 3. Because if we pass and it's not enough, if it's the 500, I think it was Rachel, then are we going to go back multiple years from now and ask for more? Then that's going to confuse and irritate people even more. So if we're already focused and need to focus on an educational platform, it might as well be the 600. Right?
What's the board's anticipation if the data is if the survey data is telling us that our constituents would support an increase at the $300 or $400 per pupil, and if you want to do just a 2-question, why don't you have the first question be a not just renewal, but it would be a revoke because we're a year early, and an increase at a smaller data supported number that would involve maybe $300 at $132 annually or $400 at $180 annually, and then make the second question be the 600.
That was one of the things that Don proposed to us. And I don't hate that idea, especially if we keep the number to where the data says that we have a chance of passing it. The only thing that I don't like about it is I feel like there's going to be people who are going to want something to say no to. And it just reduces our chances of getting the levy renewed, I guess, is my gut on that.
Yeah.
I know we have another chance at it next year, but then it just becomes kind of a gun to the wall kind of situation. But
That's I have a grave concern because you lose the tax decrease aspect of the renewal just by itself.
Then if conceptually, then it would require quite a bit of education for question 2, 3 or question 2.
Yep.
And I think you risk it more at just 2 questions when you just want a renewal. If you do 3 questions, it's not necessarily, it just will, when Don had the conversation with me, he said, that's been done before. It just requires quite a bit of education.
which I think we're going to need anyway, right?
Right.
I think any situation we have, we're going to need a very heavy education campaign. But
The last time we asked 3 questions, we ended up with an operating levy to operate a school that didn't exist.
that's a good point.
So that was confusing all on its own.
Well, and that was a bit of a unique situation, right? I mean, but yes,
That was a mixture of a bond and levy.
Yep.
We had a bond and a levy in the same ballot, yeah.
Yep. Land building levy.
Yeah. So I would like, so I can't really tell from the discussion. I know 3 questions is confusing. I can't tell if people are leaning towards wanting to be able to use the survey data to drive the increase amount or wanting to be able to drive the tolerance for cuts, right? So we've talked about both. And I also can't tell if people are thinking 2 questions versus 3. I'd kind of like everyone to chime in so that we can make sure that we're hearing everyone's opinion on the topic.
I mean, I was a 3, but I do kind of like Matt's thought on if we're going to use the survey data and we feel 300 per pupil will pass, and obviously the renewal will pass. I guess now I'm leaning towards that scenario of 2 questions with the increase right away.
So 1 question, revoke and increase, and second question. Second
question gets us to 600.
Okay.
This is I just heard of this now, so I hadn't thought of that. I mean, obviously I don't know, the 3 question to me, like I say, I like it for the data, but that means that I feel it's going to fail. So why would I support that?
I'll jump in. I feel like based on the data, based on the track record, the history that Amy has brought up, I mean, I feel like with the 3 question option, we have a pretty good chance of educating everybody enough that we'll get at least the first 2 questions passed. when we went out for the building referendum, we pretty much didn't think we were going to get the second question passed, and it passed. And it was because of a lot of really hard work from a lot of really great volunteers. And I just believe if you don't ask, the answer is definitely no. So I kind of lean towards the original 3 question, Lisa, if you're taking notes.
Would anyone else like to offer an opinion or a potential scenario?
Well, I was waiting because I feel like I've done a ton of talking as it is, but I guess for me, I would go. I'm less interested in the revoke and increase than I am in 3 questions. But I think 2 would work. If you did a renewal and a 600, I think that's a better option in my mind. If it's 2 questions. And then if it's 3 questions, it's 3 questions. And I understand the logic between the 500 and 600. I would just think a scenario in a 3 question that was a little bit more aligned with where we had somewhat majority, which I think was the 400,
Yeah.
400, 600. But that's just my 2 cents.
Okay. Yeah, the 2 questions of a renew and a 600 makes me a little nervous. I got to be honest with you. I am not opposed to 3 questions with good education, but I would probably, I think I'm swayed a little bit to make it 400, not 500 for question 2. Just because I feel like we have more data that would support that passing, even though it means more cuts.
Can you repeat that, Lisa? You broke up for me. I'm sorry. What did you say?
I said I definitely, the 2 question of a renewal and then the full 600 kind of makes me a little nervous.
Mhm.
I think that I could be persuaded to change the second question of the increase to go from 500 to 400, which the survey data, I think, slightly more supports the potential of that passing than the 500. Even though I know that means we'd be making more cuts again, which is what I'm trying to avoid with the second question. But I think if we're trying to just make sure that second question gives us fewer cuts but a higher chance of passing, then that's where I would lean.
This is Sue. I'm totally new to this from a knowledge base and a lot of experience that the rest of you have on this topic. To me, the renewal question seems like a just do it for people because of, and it seems like it would be, in my mind, that's something that we have that we should take advantage of, right? From a static tax perspective for people. I also, based on what I've heard, learned I'm leaning more with the 3 question concept. I don't like the revoke, and renew idea. I think that's risky just from a psychological perspective on the voters. They're going to see an increase, and for those that have had a tough year or are absolutely against any kind of tax increase, they would vote no for that. So that's where I'm leaning, is the 3 question.
And then how do you feel about the amount for the second question?
I'm not as solid on that, Lisa, to be honest, Like I don't have firm, yeah, I'm not as solid on that. I also like the idea. I mean, to me, what you just explained, somewhat cutting the difference between not going, saying, yeah, we're still going to make cuts, but they won't be as much. Maybe something that's more sellable, than saying, we're hardly making any cuts. I think part of this is showing that fiduciary responsibility of we're using the dollars as wisely as we can, to mitigate mitigate the impact to the taxpayers while also continuing the excellence in education that we offer to the students. So I think it's a balance in my mind.
Okay.
The only thing I would say is I am more opposed to having just a straight renewal question because it does nothing to alleviate our situation. It just prolongs something that's already bad. So I would like to see all the questions have some kind of additional dollars attached to it. If we're going to do it, we should do it to prevent cuts at this point.
So that's different from what we talked about as a committee as well. Can you explain a little bit more about what you think that would?
I like the option that Matt brought forward, that 2 questions with the first one being Renew Plus, because we have a second year if it doesn't pass. And so if a Renew Plus goes through and we're able to cover it, that's not a bad situation. I think if a Renew goes through and we're not able to get any dollars, we're still in the same bad situation we're in right now. We're going to be making cuts and people are going to be mad because they're going to say, well, we renewed the levy and you didn't ask for enough and you gave us that option. Because as educated as we want people to be, they're only going to be so educated. And when they see that lower dollar amount, they're going to be like, well, that must be enough to do it. And they're going to look at everything else as extra and additional. And so I do like that second option that Matt came up with, which was a Renew Plus.
Yeah, actually, when you put it like that, Rachel, that actually makes a lot of sense.
I was thinking the same thing. That really was a helpful way of stating it.
So now we're back to one question.
No.
Well, I mean, if we're going to just ask for what we need, because that's what we need, then why are we asking for less? So that means if we ask for less, that means we're fine making cuts. So like you said, we have to, no one's going to say it out loud, right? I'm fine making cuts. No one wants to make cuts.
Well, I mean, I guess where I was going is that we could have one question which is a revoke and add and have it be the add to 600. I think that's a little bit of political suicide, to be perfectly honest, right? But a Renew Plus, something that we feel like the taxpayers can support, that shows that, yes, we know we're going to have to make some cuts here, but maybe a second question is giving the voters the choice to use Brenda's, because I see Corey and Brenda here, right? To use Corey's comment earlier, right? Like, you're not going to get it if you don't ask. There might be a handful of people out there that want the chance to vote yes for an increase that's going to avoid any cuts. Let's get that data and see what that looks like. But that could be a scenario as well, where it's a 2-question approach, which is a renew and increase up to for an additional 400, and then a second question of 600.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now. The 2 question that you just said. To Rachel's point. Rachel's point
I
is a
do
good
like
one.
the way that Rachel is thinking through it, right? Because even though I know that there might be a bunch of people who are just looking for some sort of option that's not going to increase their taxes at all, we as a district would be essentially saying that we're okay with that as a scenario. And I don't think anyone in this room wants to say that we're okay with that as a scenario. I could be wrong, but I don't think we're saying that we want that to end up being what we walk away from the polls with in November, which is having to make $1 million in cuts. So I think that's where I'm leaning right now too, to be honest.
And assuming that Don has more experience at this than we do, and that was his suggestion.
Yeah,
I
it
feel-
was him throwing out an alternative for us to avoid a complicated 3-question ballot and trying to use the survey data to combine, like, what would it look like, right? What is the tolerance of our taxpayers to pay in order to avoid cuts? And how do we combine those two things together to maximize both what the taxpayers are telling us they'll tolerate through the survey data, as well as what we know as a board in terms of what we think we need to avoid more cuts. Well, again, I don't think we have to 100% decide tonight. I think we had a lot of data to look at. I think I would encourage us all to sleep on this, maybe eat on it. I don't know about you guys, but my stomach is growling like a crazy one right now, so I'm starving. But maybe we need to think about it. I'm happy to have some conversations offline with each of you. I think we could all talk to Matt and Mary, dive into the numbers a little bit more if we still have questions. But I think this was a good discussion. I think we all got some good information from each other. Does anyone else have any other questions or concerns before we wrap it up for the night?
I would just like to say great session, man. There were some great comments and questions tonight, and I appreciate the dialogue. It helped me come up the curve. I think the committee's done a great job. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for being willing to chime in and offer some opposing viewpoints.
Yeah, this isn't going to help me one way or the other, but Mary, I think I would be interested in getting some information about just a deeper look into activities and having not sitting on that committee, but looking at kind of that JV impact as well as we think about certain cut scenarios. I think we need to, like, I appreciated, Matt, the proposed policy kind of that you sent over that got me really thinking about activities and how we fund it and what percentage it is to the overall budget of the district. So I would be curious in just a couple of those scenarios. Like I said, I don't want to complicate it for part of these scenarios or discussions, but I definitely think it's something we should think about and look at as a board, when that happens.
I agree with you, Amy. I think once we get into a conversation about, all right, well, now we know, I mean, we're going to know as soon as we set the ballot questions what kind of cuts we're up against next year. Yep. So I think we should be talking as a board about, breaking down the budget a little bit more and looking at what else we could be doing to get creative with what that looks like. So
yeah, I mean, if that saves 2 FTE teaching positions in classrooms and people have to pay for JV athletics, then I think that's something we need to think about. So
I'll put together more information, Amy.
Okay.
Or we could look at that policy that I'm going to be proposing to increase the range in the percentage of what gets covered by all activities in general.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways I think that we can look at it, but the numbers, the straight up numbers don't change. It's what do we do to get those numbers? I think that we could certainly talk about. If we're talking about $600,000 in cuts based on what we put on the ballot, we could start talking about that as soon as we decide on the ballot, right?
Correct. Yep.
So that speaks to a little bit of time frame potential. Is the board comfortable of a time frame at the June school board meeting? I think we can wait until July, whether it's in a special session or not, but I've got to do a little bit more homework on how quickly we can turn around that piece. I just remember that July is pushing the edge of the envelope if we're going out in the fall.
Yeah, and I think just given that every scenario we've talked about is going to require one hell of an education campaign, the sooner we can get started on it, the better. So I would like to try to push the board to get to consensus by the June timeframe, and I'm happy to have conversations offline, or if we need to pull together again as a broader group, we can do that as well.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
We're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.